Margaret was quietly sipping her drink until the leather-jacketed men surrounded her table. "Come on, beautiful, have some fun with us," they said, and that's when the old man in the corner stood up. The biker gang started laughing. 10 minutes later, they were waiting for the ambulance. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you believe real hero stories deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button, because this story proves some uniforms are never truly taken off. Murphy's bar sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, usually quiet and peaceful. That Saturday evening was no different. Dim lights cast long shadows across old wooden tables, and faded photographs decorated the walls like memories refusing to fade. In the corner booth sat 76-year-old Frank Johnson, wearing a worn flannel shirt, old jeans, and scuffed but clean shoes. A cold beer rested in his weathered hands, while his eyes distantly focused on the old television mounted above the bar. Anyone looking at Frank would see the same thing: a retired, lonely, quiet old man. No one knew he'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, that he'd been a sergeant in Special Forces, or that the Bronze Star Medal now tucked away in his bedroom drawer had been earned pulling 3 soldiers from a burning jeep under enemy fire. The bar's peaceful atmosphere was shattered when the front door burst open. Heavy boots echoed across the wooden floor, followed by the rustle of leather jackets and loud, aggressive conversations. Frank's military instincts kicked in automatically. He assessed the threat without moving his head. 5 bikers had entered, led by a man around 35 with the build of a linebacker and arms covered in crude tattoos. The others looked similar: leather jackets adorned with patches, chains hanging from their belts, and the kind of swagger that came from intimidating people who couldn't fight back. In the opposite corner sat Margaret Chin, a 28-year-old nurse at Millbrook General Hospital. After a brutal 12-hour shift dealing with everything from heart attacks to car accidents, she'd come to Murphy's for what she hoped would be a quiet glass of wine and a few chapters of her book. She was the kind of person who made the world better simply by existing, gentle with patients, patient with difficult families, and always the first to volunteer for the worst shifts so her colleagues could spend time with their children. The biker group approached the bar with the confidence of men who'd never faced real consequences. They ordered beers and immediately began making crude jokes loud enough for everyone to hear. Frank noticed Margaret unconsciously hunching over a book, trying to become invisible. He recognized the body language. He'd seen it in villages during the war, when civilians tried to avoid notice from dangerous men. "Hey, boys, check out the entertainment," said the leader, who we learned was named Jake Morrison. His voice carried particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. "Looks like we got ourselves a lonely little bookworm over there." His companions laughed with the enthusiasm of hyenas sensing weakness. One of them, a wiry man with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck, added, "Maybe she needs some company. Looks like she's never had any fun in her life." Frank's grip on his beer bottle tightened. He'd heard this before: predators circling prey, testing boundaries, escalating slowly until someone got hurt. During his tours, he'd learned to recognize the signs that preceded violence. Every instinct told him to act, but his rational mind counseled patience. Maybe they'd just talk. Maybe they'd get bored and leave. Jake stood up from the bar, beer in hand, and began walking toward Margaret's table. His friends followed like a pack, their boots creating an ominous rhythm on the wooden floor. Margaret looked up from her book, and Frank saw the fear flash across her face before she quickly lowered her eyes again. "Well, hello there, beautiful," Jake said, his voice dripping with false friendliness as he loomed over Margaret's small table. "That's quite a big book for such a pretty little head. What's it about?" Margaret forced a polite smile, the kind healthcare workers perfected when dealing with difficult patients. "Good evening. It's just a novel, nothing special. I was actually about to leave." She started to close her book and reach for her purse. "Leave." Jake's friend with the neck tattoo laughed. "But you just got here. We saw you coming an hour ago. Been watching you this whole time." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "That's very observant of you. Margaret said carefully. But I really do need to go. Early shift tomorrow. She stood up, but Jake moved to block her path. Come on now, Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Don't be so unfriendly. We're just trying to be social. You look like you could use some excitement in your life. Frank watched Margaret's shoulders tense. She was trying to de-escalate, to be polite enough to avoid making them angry, while firm enough to make them back off. It was a delicate balance that women had to master just to survive in a world where the wrong response to unwanted attention could turn dangerous. I appreciate the offer, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear Frank could see in her posture, but I'm really not interested in company tonight. Thank you for understanding. She tried to step around Jake, but he moved to block her again. This time, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. I don't think you understand, Jake said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. We're not asking. That's when Frank Johnson stood up. The movement was deliberate, controlled. 76 years of life had taught him the value of choosing his moments carefully. He left a $10 bill on his table, enough to cover his beer and a generous tip for Sarah, the bartender who always made sure his glass stayed full, and began walking toward Margaret's table. Each step was measured, purposeful. Frank's body might have been aged, but his mind was calculating distances, angles, potential weapons, escape routes. The tactical awareness that had kept him alive in Southeast Asian jungles had never left him, even after 4 decades of civilian life. Excuse me, Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Even though he spoke quietly, I believe the young lady asked you to leave her alone. Jake turned, and Frank saw the exact moment when the biker assessed him as a threat. The younger man's eyes swept over Frank's gray hair, his worn clothes, his slightly stooped shoulders, and dismissed him entirely. Listen, Grandpa, Jake said with a laugh that invited his friends to join in. This ain't your business. Go back to your corner and finish your beer before you get hurt. Frank took another step closer, and something in his bearing made the laughter die in Jake's throat. Son, Frank said, his voice still calm but carrying undertones of steel, I'm asking you nicely. Let the lady go and we can all finish our evening in peace. The bar had gone quiet. Even the jukebox seemed to sense a tension and let the last song fade without starting another. Sarah behind the bar had her hand on the phone, ready to call for help. The few other patrons were trying to decide whether to intervene, leave, or just stay out of the way. Jake looked around at his audience and made a decision. He couldn't back down in front of his crew and the entire bar. Or what? Oh, man, you gonna make me? Frank's response was to step even closer, now within arm's reach of the much larger man. Let her go, he repeated, and this time there was no request in his voice. It was a command, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who'd given orders that meant the difference between life and death. Jake laughed, but it sounded forced now. Boys, can you believe this? Methuselah here thinks he's going to teach us some manners. He turned back to Frank. I got about 50 pounds and 40 years on you, old man. You sure you want to do this? Frank's answer was to reach out and place his hand on Jake's wrist, the same wrist that was holding Margaret. Last chance, he said quietly. Jake tried to jerk his hand away, but Frank's grip was like a steel trap. The younger man's eyes widened in surprise. What the hell? Marine Corps teaches you things that stick, Frank said conversationally. Now, you're going to let the lady go, apologize for bothering her, and we're all going to pretend this never happened. Instead of complying, Jake swung his free hand in a wild haymaker toward Frank's head. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but would be replayed in the minds of everyone present for years to come. Frank ducked under the punch with fluid grace, stepped inside Jake's guard, and executed a perfectly controlled hip throw that sent the much larger man crashing into an empty table. The sound of splintering wood and Jake's shocked grunt of pain echoed through the silent bar. Jake's friends stared in disbelief for a heartbeat before charging forward to help their leader. Frank was ready for them. The first man to reach him was the one with the neck tattoo. Frank caught his reaching arm, stepped to the side, and used the man's own momentum to send him headfirst into the bar. The second attacker came from Frank's left, but a simple leg sweep sent him tumbling over a chair. The remaining two bikers stopped their advance, suddenly uncertain. The old man they dismissed as harmless was standing calmly among their unconscious friends, not even breathing hard. "Jesus Christ," one of them whispered. "Who is this guy?" Frank straightened his shirt and looked around the bar. "Anyone else want to dance?" he asked mildly. The silence stretched for several seconds before the front door burst open and two police officers rushed in, hands on their weapons. Officer David Santos and his partner, Officer Kim Rodriguez, had been driving by when Sarah's 911 call came through. "What's the situation here?" Santos called out, taking the scene of groaning bikers and the elderly man standing calmly beside them. One of the conscious bikers pointed an accusatory finger at Frank. "That old bastard attacked us. We were just talking to the girl, and he went crazy." Officer Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Sir, are you injured?" she asked Frank. "No, ma'am," Frank replied politely. "Just helped a young lady who was being bothered." Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaky but clear. "Officers, these men were harassing me. They wouldn't let me leave. This gentleman intervened when they became physical." Santos studied Frank more carefully. Something about the old man's bearing, his calm demeanor in the aftermath of violence, seemed familiar. "Sir, what's your name?" "Frank Johnson," came the reply. Rodriguez's eyes widened. "Johnson? Frank Johnson from Elm Street? You're Tommy Rodriguez's neighbor, aren't you?" "My father." "That's right," Frank said with a slight smile. "How's your dad doing?" "Haven't seen him since his retirement party." "He's good, sir. He talks about you sometimes." "About Vietnam." She turned to her partner. "Dave, this is Sergeant Frank Johnson. Special Forces. My dad served with him." The atmosphere in the bar shifted immediately. Santos looked at Frank with new respect, while the bikers seemed to shrink into themselves. "Sergeant," Santos said formally, "what exactly happened here?" Frank gave a concise military-style report. 5 subjects approached and harassed female patron. Verbal escalation to physical contact. Intervention necessary to prevent assault. Subjects became aggressive. Minimum force applied to neutralize threat. As he spoke, Jake struggled to his feet, holding his ribs. "You didn't tell us you were military," he said, his earlier aggression replaced by something approaching respect. "Shouldn't matter," Frank replied. "Every person deserves basic respect, whether they served or not." Margaret approached Frank, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "No need to thank me, miss," Frank said gently. "Just glad you're safe." Officer Rodriguez was running Jake's ID through the system. "Mr. Morrison, you have 3 prior arrests for assault and 1 for harassment. Given what I'm hearing from witnesses, you're looking at charges for assault, harassment, and public intoxication." "Wait," Jake said desperately. "Can't we just... we didn't know he was a war hero. We were just having some fun." Santos stepped closer to Jake. "Having fun? You call intimidating a woman trying to read a book fun? You call grabbing her against her will fun?" Frank held up a hand. "Officers, if Mr. Morrison and his friends would like to apologize to the young lady and promise this won't happen again, I'd be satisfied with that." Jake looked at Margaret, then back at Frank. The fight had gone out of him completely. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I apologize. That was way out of line. We had no right to bother you." His friends nodded their agreement, some still nursing bruises from their encounter with Frank's gentle intervention. Margaret studied them for a moment, then nodded. Apology accepted. "Just please remember that women are people, not entertainment." Rodriguez looked at Santos, who shrugged. "Sergeant Johnson, you pressing charges?" "No, ma'am. Just want everyone to go home safe tonight, after the bikers have been escorted out with stern warnings about their future conduct. Frank found himself sitting with Margaret at her table. Sarah had brought them both fresh drinks on the house. She insisted. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said, "Back there, when you stood up, weren't you scared? They were so much bigger than you." Frank considered the question seriously. "Fear is a tool," he said finally. "It tells you when there's danger, but you can't let it make your decisions for you. Sometimes doing the right thing means being scared and doing it anyway." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "In the hospital, we see a lot of people who've been hurt by others, women especially. Most of the time, nobody steps in to help. Most people don't know how," Frank said, "and that's not their fault. But when you know how to help and you don't, that's when it becomes your fault." They talked for another hour about her work at the hospital, his memories of the service, their shared belief that people should look out for each other. When Margaret finally left, she shook Frank's hand and said, "I hope I see you around. Frank Johnson. The world needs more people like you." Frank finished his beer and walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook. He didn't feel like a hero. He'd just done what any decent person should do when they see someone in trouble. But as he unlocked his front door and saw the framed flag that had covered his best friend's coffin in 1968, he allowed himself a small smile. Some battles never end. Some uniforms never really come off. And sometimes the most important fights happen not in distant jungles, but in neighborhood bars where ordinary people need someone to stand up for what's right. The next week, Frank returned to Murphy's for his usual Saturday beer. Margaret was there too, reading at her table. When she saw him come in, she waved him over. "Mind if I buy a drink for my guardian angel?" she asked. Frank chuckled. "I'm no angel, miss. Just an old Marine who doesn't like bullies." And that's how a friendship began, built on respect, forged in a moment of crisis, and sustained by the simple understanding that good people watch out for each other. If this story moved you, write respect in the comments and subscribe to Silent Valor Stories. Because real heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just wear flannel shirts and carry the quiet strength that comes from knowing right from wrong.